For 42 years, my name was Dr. Alistair Finch, a tenured primatologist, published in all the right journals, respected. Then, I became a laughingstock, the man who chased a shadow in the woods, who sacrificed a career for a ghost story. Now I'm just an old man in a quiet room, talking to this microphone. I'm talking because the secret has grown too heavy to carry alone. It's been a weight on my soul for decades. I know where they live, and I truly wish to God that I didn't. You see, their home isn't some hidden valley, a lush Shangri-La untouched by man. It's nothing so romantic. What I found, what he showed me, was a tomb. A slow, agonizing decay brought on by a secret our own world buried and forgot. This isn't the story you think it is. It all began in a place that already hums with memory and myth. The deep, damp woods of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Specifically, in that tangled, primeval stretch of wilderness south of Ape Canyon, a place that still feels like it's holding its breath, remembering the day Mount St. Helens tore the sky apart. My life there was built on a foundation of routine, a ritual of science. Every morning, I logged the atmospheric pressure, the humidity, the temperature. Every Tuesday, I'd walk the grid to collect data from my trail cams, a weekly ritual of disappointment that yielded nothing but the familiar shapes of deer, the occasional black bear, and the maddening dance of falling leaves. It was all meticulously recorded, the kind of boring, repeatable data that builds credibility. That credibility was a fortress I built brick by brick, and it was the only thing I had left. My colleagues back at the university, they'd look at the plaster casts of tracks I brought back, their faces a mixture of pity and professional disdain. Over cups of lukewarm coffee in the faculty lounge, they'd dismiss them as hoaxes, misidentified bear prints, or the sad delusions of a man who'd spent too much time alone. But I knew the forest. I knew the feel of the air there, that specific texture of heavy wetness that smells of Douglas fir, decaying maple leaves, and the cold, metallic tang of volcanic soil. The sounds had a rhythm. The silence had a weight. You don't spend 40 years in a place without learning its language. And the language of that forest was beginning to whisper something new. I wasn't there for fame. Not anymore. I was there because my wife, Eleanor, had believed. She was the one who first read me the old stories, the reports from miners and loggers, her eyes alight with a possibility that my scientific mind was trained to dismiss. After I lost her to cancer, that belief was the only piece of her I had left to hold on to. My research, it stopped being about science. It became a 42-year-long conversation with a ghost. Every data point I logged, every fruitless mile I hiked, was a word whispered to her. My obsession had been a wall between us in her final years. A deep, silent guilt I could never articulate. Out there, in the woods she loved, I thought maybe I could find a way to say I was sorry. The change, when it came, wasn't a roar. It wasn't the cinematic crash you might expect. It was the opposite. It was a sudden, profound, and impossible silence. One overcast Tuesday, the forest just stopped. One moment, it was a symphony of life, the chittering of squirrels, the distant call of a Steller's jay, the ever-present drone of insects. The next, nothing. An absolute void of sound that was so complete, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. The only thing I could hear was the thick, terrified thrum of my own blood and the faintest whisper of wind moving through the highest canopy, like the world was breathing a mile above my head. The forest has rules. That day, the first rule was made clear. When it tells you to listen, you listen. And in that deafening quiet, it happened. A single, heavy thud. It wasn't loud, but it was definitive. A rock, about the size of a man's fist, landed in the damp soil and moss not 5 feet to my left. It didn't fall from a branch. It didn't roll down a hill. There was no preceding sound of its movement, just its final, stark arrival. It wasn't a warning shot. It felt more deliberate, more intelligent than that. It felt like a statement, a period placed at the end of a long, unspoken sentence, a sentence that said, "I am here, I see you." My heart was a hammer against my ribs, but my legs didn't move. The old terror was there, but something else rose to meet it. A lifetime of academic curiosity. My first choice defined everything that came after. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to scramble back to the false security of my truck and the paved road. to abandon the conversation with Eleanor's ghost and accept the pitying smiles of my colleagues, but I didn't. I saw the rock, not as a threat, but as an invitation, a test. My scientific mind gave way to something more primal, more human. I slowly knelt down, my knees cracking in the silence, and I did the only thing that felt right. I looked toward the impenetrable wall of green from where the rock must have come, and I whispered. My voice was a dry, cracking thing. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said to the silence. "I'm just listening." For a long moment, the silence held me in its grip. The world remained paused, waiting for my next move. I didn't make one. I just stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, a man confessing his peaceful intentions to an unseen god of the woods. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had vanished, the sound returned. It started with a single, tentative chirp from a chickadee, then another. The squirrels resumed their scolding chatter. The drone of the insects faded back in, knitting the world back together. The pressure in my ears eased. The event was over. It had been controlled. It had been deliberate. The forest was breathing again. I never wrote about it in my official log. It was the first and most important secret. To a review board, it would have been proof of my instability. An auditory hallucination, a paranoid delusion. But to me, it was proof of everything Eleanor had believed. It was the first syllable of a reply in my long, one-sided conversation. I walked over and picked up the rock. It was a simple piece of granite, unremarkable except for the fact that it had just crossed the vast, silent gulf between two different worlds. It felt warm in my hand, or maybe that was just my own trembling. I put it in my pocket, a piece of evidence I could never show to anyone, a covenant. That day marked the end of my research and the beginning of my education. I thought I knew that forest, but I had only been reading the cover. Now, a door had been opened a crack, and I had chosen to whisper through it instead of slamming it shut. I didn't know it then, but I had just taken the first step in a long, strange ritual. A pact was being offered, and I was about to spend the rest of my life learning the terms. That single rock was a question, and the answer would cost me everything I had: my name, my career, and eventually, my peace of mind. But it would also give me the one thing I craved: a real answer for Eleanor. This is a hard story to tell. It's been locked inside me for so long, and it only gets harder from here. If you're willing to listen to the rest of this old man's confession, do me a kindness. Go ahead and click the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and maybe share this with someone you trust. You'll want to stay until the very end, because you need to understand why I'm finally breaking my silence, and why some truths are more terrifying than the monsters we imagine. The silence is the easy part. It's what came next that haunts me. The rock sat on my desk for a week, a cold, dense piece of the impossible. Every time my gaze fell on it, I would hear that silence again, that profound and sudden emptiness in the forest. It was a question I couldn't answer with my usual methods. Data, observation, and plaster cast were the tools for studying an animal. This was different. This felt like the prelude to a conversation. To respond with a camera trap or a microphone felt rude, uncouth. I needed a different language, one of gesture and intent. I had to offer something back, not as bait for an experiment, but as a sign of respect, a gift to acknowledge the one that had been given to me, that stark, terrifying, and beautiful moment of quiet acknowledgement. It was the only path forward. I found the answer in the back of a dusty cupboard, Eleanor's old cast-iron skillet. It was heavy, seasoned with decades of use, a faint patina of rust blooming on one edge from disuse. Holding it was like holding a memory. It was real, tangible, a piece of our shared life. It felt like the perfect vessel, something that carried a history of providing nourishment and warmth. Taking it back to the forest felt like I was finally bringing her with me, not just her memory, but her belief, forged into iron. I drove out to the forest, the skillet on the passenger seat like a silent companion. I found the spot, not far from where the rock had landed. A colossal, lightning-scarred cedar stood there like a cathedral spire, its ancient presence making it a natural altar. This was the place. My offering had to be deliberate. Simple, clean, unambiguous. I chose Fuji apples. Their bright red skins a stark contrast to the deep greens and browns of the forest floor. They were sweet, a source of clean energy, something that couldn't be misinterpreted as a threat. At the first light of dawn the next Tuesday, I walked to the cedar tree. The air was cold and sharp. The act itself felt ridiculous, the desperate ritual of a lonely old man. I polished each apple on my sleeve before placing it in the skillet. My voice was a dry whisper in the morning quiet. "A gift," I said to the silent trees. "Just a gift." Then I turned my back and walked away, my heart pounding with a strange, fragile hope, fully expecting to return to a skillet full of untouched apples and a renewed sense of my own foolishness. The waiting was a form of low-grade torture. The entire day was a wash. I couldn't read, couldn't focus on my notes. My mind was a battlefield, with scientific skepticism warring against a desperate, irrational hope. I imagined a bear finding the apples, or a troop of raccoons scattering them across the forest floor. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, I couldn't wait any longer. I drove back, my hands tight on the steering wheel. I walked the trail with a sense of impending judgment. The woods were quiet, but it was a normal quiet this time. As I neared the cedar, I could see the dark shape of the skillet at its base. My breath caught in my throat. It was empty. Not a single core, not a scrap of peel, nothing. And the skillet itself, it was clean, impossibly clean. No smudges from a wet snout, no claw marks, just empty. The apples were gone. The gift had been accepted. This became my new religion, my true research. The scientific method was abandoned for a ritual of faith. Every Tuesday, at dawn, without fail, I would make the pilgrimage. The skillet, 6 Fuji apples, placed at the base of the cedar. Then I would leave. I would not return until dusk. In those first few weeks, the only reward was the empty skillet. But that was enough. It was a confirmation, a silent, ongoing dialogue. I started to learn the unspoken rules. I instinctively left my bear spray in the truck, and I certainly never brought a firearm. It was a place of peace, and a weapon, even for protection. Felt like a violation. It would be like walking into a church and shouting. It would break the trust that was being so carefully, so silently, built between us. After the 4th Tuesday, the terms of the exchange changed. I arrived at dusk to find the skillet empty, as I now expected, but this time something had been left behind. Lying in the center of the dark iron was a small, intricately woven braid of cedar bark. It was still green, fragrant with the sharp, clean scent of the tree it came from. The weave was tight and complex, a pattern of interlocking strands that was far beyond the capability of any known animal. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was light, delicate, and powerful. It was a receipt. It was a thank you note written in the language of the forest. The pact was real. It wasn't just me leaving gifts. It was a trade, an exchange of courtesies between two vastly different worlds. I had given food, and he had given art. The unwritten rules of our pact began to solidify through trial and error. One Tuesday morning, a flat tire delayed me. By the time I got to the trail, the sun was already well above the horizon. I hurried, feeling anxious, not wanting to break the established rhythm. As I neared the clearing with the cedar tree, a sound ripped through the air that stopped me dead. A single, sharp, explosive crack, like a giant striking a tree with a Louisville slugger. It echoed from the ridge above, a visceral, percussive command. It wasn't an animal sound, it was a signal. It meant, "You are too late. The time is not right. Go back." I stood frozen for a full minute, then slowly backed away, the message received with chilling clarity. I learned that day, the offering was for dawn, the collection was for dusk. The time in between was his. The signs he left became more practical, more like a dialogue about the world we shared. One week, I found a large, heavy dead branch laid perfectly across the trail I always used. It was an obvious and deliberate obstruction. My first reaction was annoyance. I was tired, and the thought of scrambling around it was irritating. But a new instinct, born of these strange encounters, told me to stop, to look. I pushed through the brush to the side and peered past the roadblock. Not 50 feet ahead, the trail had vanished. A recent flash flood had carved a new, deep ravine right through it. A fall into that muddy, tangled mess would have been disastrous, easily resulting in a broken leg or worse. The branch hadn't been an obstacle, it had been a warning, my apples for his guidance, my safety. The most profound and undeniable proof of his intelligence came on a wet autumn afternoon. I was returning at dusk, my mind lost in a fog of memory. thinking of Eleanor and how she would have marveled at all this. As I approached the cedar, I saw that something was wrong. The skillet wasn't in its usual place at the base of the tree. It had been moved about 10 feet to the right, sitting perfectly upright on a patch of moss. I felt a flash of irritation. Did a bear drag it? But it was placed with such care. Confused, I walked toward its original spot, my eyes on the ground. And then I saw it. Right where the skillet should have been, right where my next footstep would have landed, was a small, innocent-looking patch of leaves. My blood ran cold. It was aconite, wolfsbane, a plant so toxic that even skin contact with its oils can be dangerous, causing numbness, even cardiac arrest. The skillet hadn't just been moved. It had been placed with purpose. It was a marker, a shield. It had saved my life. My heart was hammering against my ribs from the near miss with the wolfsbane. I crouched down, my legs weak, to get a better look at the ground. I needed to anchor myself in reality, to process what had just happened. He had actively protected me. The thought was staggering, and as I stared at the damp earth where he had placed the skillet, my world tilted on its axis for the second time. There, pressed into the soil, were the prints. One was huge, the familiar elongated shape I had tried so desperately to prove existed. But right next to it, nestled beside it like a shadow, was another. A perfect, miniature replica. The same shape, the same distinct anatomy, but it was small. It was the footprint of a child. My mind shut down for a second, unable to process the implication. He wasn't alone. They were a family. This new knowledge was a tectonic shift in my understanding. This wasn't just an encounter with a solitary, cryptic primate. I was interacting with a parent, a father who was protecting his family, and who had extended that protection to include me. The apples I brought weren't just for him. They were for his child. The realization washed over me in a wave of profound empathy, immediately followed by a much deeper and more urgent fear. This was no longer a matter of scientific curiosity. This was a moral responsibility of staggering weight. This new fact, this tiny footprint, became a secret within the larger secret. Looking at that delicate impression in the mud, I knew with absolute certainty that this could never be recorded, never be shared, never be whispered to another soul. To reveal it would be the most profound and unforgivable betrayal. The true nature of our pact was finally clear to me. It wasn't a scientific study or a mystical quest. It was, in its own strange way, a domestic arrangement, a neighborhood agreement. I brought a weekly gift of food, a simple, dependable offering of peace. In return, he, and I knew now it was a father, watched over me. He warned me of rock slides and poison plants. He spoke to me in a silent language of woven bark and carefully placed stones. The forest was his home, and I was a privileged guest, allowed to visit under a strict but unspoken set of rules. Respect the time, respect the space. Come in peace, or do not come at all. The primal fear I once felt was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a deep, abiding awe and a cold, growing dread of what the outside world would do if it ever discovered his family. My entire purpose shifted. The weekly trips to the cedar were no longer about proving a theory or chasing Eleanor's ghost. They were about maintaining a fragile, vital relationship. The cast iron skillet and the Fuji apples were the grammar of our shared language. The gifts he left in return were his vocabulary. I began to see the forest not as a collection of trees and animals, but as a territory, a sovereign nation of two, with a silent, powerful guardian. The silence between the trees no longer felt empty. It felt charged with awareness, with intent. I was no longer a scientist observing a subject. I was a participant, a foreign diplomat engaged in a delicate, ongoing negotiation with something ancient and wild. And I was utterly, completely alone in this knowledge. This routine, this ritual, became the anchor of my life. It brought a strange comfort, but also an isolation more profound than any I had ever known. I was the sole keeper of a truth so immense it felt like it could crack the world in two. The image of that small, child-sized footprint was burned into my mind. It was a fact that had no place in the world I came from. Who could I ever tell? How could I explain a silent pact with a monster who left thank you notes and worried about my safety? The secret was a stone, much heavier than the one he first threw, and it was tied directly to my soul. The weekly trade was no longer a choice. It was an obligation, a sacred duty, and with every empty skillet, the mystery only deepened, pulling me further and further from the world of men and deeper into the heart of the wild. The seasons turned, and our silent pact became the central rhythm of my existence. Our dialogue deepened beyond simple trades of apples for warnings. One winter, a vicious flu laid me up for 2 weeks. I was too weak to even drive, let alone hike to the cedar tree. I was racked with fever and a profound sense of failure, certain that my absence would be seen as a betrayal, shattering the fragile trust we had built. When I finally recovered enough to make the trip, weak and coughing in the icy air, I expected to find nothing. Instead, when I reached the altar of the great cedar, I found the skillet was not empty. Inside was a small, carefully arranged pile of yarrow and elderflower. My breath misted in the cold as I stared. These were herbs I knew well from Eleanor's old gardening books, traditional remedies for fever and lung congestion. He hadn't seen my absence as a betrayal. He had understood I was sick, and he had tried to help. It was a trade of care for care. That day, the awe I felt was so profound, it felt like grief. The communication evolved in other ways, becoming more interactive, more playful even. I had grown accustomed to his language of wood knocks, the single sharp crack for leave now, the two softer ones that seemed to mean all clear. One afternoon, feeling a strange surge of boldness, I decided to speak back. From the ridge overlooking the clearing, I heard a distinct pattern of 3 slow, deliberate knocks, a sound I hadn't heard before. After a moment of hesitation, I picked up a heavy branch and, with my heart in my throat, I struck a fallen log with the exact same rhythm: thump, thump, thump. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I waited, holding my breath. Then, from a completely different direction, much further to the west, the same pattern echoed back perfectly. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't an echo. It was a reply. We were talking. It was the first time I laughed out loud in the forest in years. A raw, incredulous sound. It was a conversation without words. A shared moment of connection across an impossible divide. But the world outside our quiet sanctuary was getting smaller, and its sounds were growing louder. It started as a low, persistent rumble on the horizon, a sound that didn't belong. A logging company had won a bid for a parcel of old-growth forest just over the ridge from the cedar tree. The sound of their chainsaws became a constant, metallic scream that shredded the sacred silence of our woods. It was a violation, an auditory assault that made the hair on my arm stand up. Every time a tree fell, I would hear a distant, booming crash, and I felt it in my bones like a personal loss. The forest has rules, and this was a flagrant, brutal violation of all of them. I noticed the signs left for me in the skillet grew more scarce, more anxious. A single, broken feather, a stone that was unnaturally cold to the touch. The dialogue was becoming strained, filled with a tension that wasn't there before. He was afraid, and that made me terrified. The real, immediate danger arrived not with the loggers, but on a bright Saturday afternoon. It came in the form of 2 tourists on loud, snarling quad bikes. They were college-age kids, laughing and shouting, tearing up the delicate forest floor as they veered far off the marked trail. I was checking a camera on a lower trail when I heard their engines getting closer. Their sound an angry hornet's nest ripping through the peace. My blood ran cold when I realized the direction they were heading. They were on a direct path to the clearing, to the great cedar. The thought of them finding the skillet, of their loud, careless intrusion into that sacred space, sent a spike of pure panic through me. This was it. The secret was about to be blown apart by sheer, random stupidity. I couldn't let it happen. I had to intervene. The pact demanded it. I was the guardian on this side of the veil. I broke into a desperate, clumsy sprint, my lungs burning as I crashed through the undergrowth. I had to get ahead of them, to cut them off. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and ferns, grabbing at my ankles. The roar of their engines grew louder, closer. I finally scrambled up a steep embankment, gasping for air, and found myself on a rocky ledge just above the path they were on. I could see them now, 2 bright helmets bobbing through the trees below. There was no time to think, only to act. I put my shoulder against a large, precariously balanced rock at the edge of the ledge. With a guttural yell, I heaved, pushing with all the strength my aging frame could muster. It teetered for a moment, and then fell, crashing down onto the slope below. It wasn't a huge landslide, but it was enough. It triggered a cascade of smaller rocks and dirt that spilled across their path, a messy, impassable barrier of debris. They skidded to a halt just feet from the slide, shouting in alarm. I didn't wait. I scrambled down the other side of the ridge, my heart hammering, and circled around to approach them from the direction they'd come. I forced my breath to steady, my face into a mask of frantic concern. "Get out of here!" I yelled, my voice cracking with manufactured panic. "Flash flood. The whole ridge is unstable. You've got to go back, now." They were young, their bravado evaporating in the face of a wild-eyed old man screaming about a flash flood on a sunny day. They looked at the rock slide, then at me, then at each other. Without another word, they spun their machines around and roared back the way they had come, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a ringing silence in their wake. I leaned against a tree, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I had done it. I had protected the clearing. I had kept the secret safe. But my desperate act had a price. It always does. The tourists, shaken and annoyed, must have reported the incident. A few days later, I found a notice tacked to the trailhead kiosk. It was a general warning about unstable slopes in the area, but at the bottom was a handwritten addendum. It requested that anyone who encountered a disoriented or confrontational elderly man in the sector should not engage and should report the sighting to the ranger station immediately. My name wasn't on it, but it didn't have to be. It was a picture of me painted in bureaucratic ink, the unstable man in the woods. I had protected the secret, but in doing so, I had made myself the monster in a different story. I had drawn a circle around myself, attracting the one kind of attention I could not afford: official scrutiny. My quiet, invisible existence was over. The pressure mounted. Survey flags, bright, ugly pink ribbons, began to appear, tied to trees closer and closer to the cedars clearing. The loggers were mapping their conquest. The chainsaw's scream was no longer distant. It was a neighbor. I felt a constant, grinding anxiety, a sense that the walls were closing in. The gifts in the skillet became more pointed, more desperate. One evening, I found a small, desiccated bird, its neck broken. It was a message of death, a vision of what was coming. The pact had shifted again. I was no longer just a guest. I was the sole defense against a coming apocalypse. My quiet ritual of apples had become a desperate daily act of reassurance. My presence a promise that I was still there, still standing guard. But I was just one old man against an army of machines. And I was losing. The quasi-disaster I had dreaded finally came. It wasn't tourists this time. It was worse. 2 hunters, dressed in full camouflage, carrying high-powered rifles. I spotted them from a ridge, moving slowly and professionally through the woods, heading with unnerving accuracy toward the most secluded part of the forest, his territory. They weren't lost. They were tracking something. My blood turned to ice. They were less than a quarter mile from the clearing. I couldn't create a rock slide, couldn't scream about a flood. They were armed, and they were not kids on quad bikes. They were predators. Panic gave way to a cold, desperate clarity. I had to use his language. I had to become the very monster they were hoping to find. The local legend, the ghost story made real. I slipped through the trees, circling wide to get ahead of them. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I found a hollow, fallen log and a heavy piece of deadwood. I waited until they were in the thickest part of the woods, where the shadows were deepest. Then I began. I slammed the wood against the log, mimicking the sharp, explosive crack he used as a warning. Crack! The sound was shocking, unnatural. I saw them freeze. Then, I let out a sound from the bottom of my soul. A low, guttural, half-human moan that devolved into a screech. It was the sound of madness, of pure, animal grief. I moved, fast and quiet, to another spot and let out another bone-chilling howl. I kept moving, crashing through brush on the other side of them, creating the illusion of a large, fast-moving creature circling them in the gloom. I didn't let them see me. I was just a voice, a terrifying sound with no source. It worked better than I could have imagined. I heard them shouting to each other, their professional calm shattered. I heard the metallic click of a safety being switched off, but there was panic in their voices. "What the hell was that?" one of them hissed. I answered with another furious crack of the log, closer this time. That was enough. They abandoned the hunt. I heard them crashing back the way they came, their retreat a panicked, clumsy scramble. I stayed hidden, shaking. until the forest was silent again. The silence returned, but it was different. It was tainted by the smell of my own fear and the echoes of the monstrous sounds I had made. I had saved him, but I had poured gasoline on the fire of my own reputation. I had given the unstable man a voice. The consequences came swiftly. 2 days later, a Forest Service truck was parked at my small, rented cabin. A ranger, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a name tag that read Martinez, stood at my door. She wasn't aggressive. She was worse. She was calm, professional, and held a file with my name on it. She spoke of multiple reports, of unusual activity, and of concerns for my personal safety. She mentioned the hunters' report of disturbing vocalizations and aggressive territorial displays. She didn't accuse me of anything directly. She just asked questions. Why was I so far off trail? What was the nature of my unsanctioned research? Her questions were scalpels, carefully dissecting my decades of privacy. She informed me that, pending a review, my long-standing research permit was suspended for the area north of the creek, the area that included the cedar tree. The blow was devastating. It was a physical shock, like being punched in the gut. Suspended. I was banned from the very place that had become the center of my life. I was cut off from the pact, from the ritual, from him. Martinez left me with a warning to stay on marked trails and a pamphlet for a county mental health service. The price for my desperate act of protection was exile. I had succeeded in scaring the hunters away, but in doing so, I had led a far greater, more methodical predator right to my doorstep. Martinez wasn't a tourist or a logger. She was the system, an intelligence that saw my love for this place as a problem to be managed. The unstable man, in the woods, was now officially on a watch list. The secret had not been revealed, but the walls around it had become a cage, and I was now on the outside looking in. I stood at the edge of the forbidden zone for days, a ghost haunting the borders of my own life. I couldn't complete the ritual. I couldn't leave the apples. I couldn't check the skillet. The silence from the woods felt different now. It felt accusatory. Had he understood? Did he think I had abandoned him? The thought was an agony worse than the flu, worse than the fear. I had made a promise to Eleanor's ghost, a promise to listen. And now, the one conversation that mattered in my life had been forcibly silenced. The isolation was absolute. The weight of the secret, combined with my new powerlessness, was crushing. The world was shrinking, the chainsaws were screaming, and I, the self-appointed guardian, was locked out, able to do nothing but watch and wait for the inevitable disaster. My bond with him, forged in silence and trust, had led directly to this. Every act of communication, every shared secret, had woven a rope that was now tightening around my neck. The intimacy of our strange relationship had not been a shield. It had been a beacon, drawing the attention of a world that could not and would not ever understand. I looked at my hands, the hands that had mimicked his calls and protected his home, and they felt useless. I had become a liability to the very being I had sworn to protect. The joy and wonder of our connection were gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the stakes. This was no longer about a scientific mystery or a personal grief. It was about survival, his and mine, and I was failing. The near disaster was not that the hunters found him. It was that in saving him, I had lost everything. The suspension was a wall of ice between my world and his. For weeks, I was a ghost haunting the edge of my own life, my ears straining against the incessant scream of chainsaws from over the ridge. The sound was a physical pain, a constant reminder of my failure. I was locked out while their home was being dismantled, tree by tree. Every evening, I'd stare into the silent woods and wonder if he thought I had abandoned him. Did he and his child have enough to eat? Was the logging driving them from their territory into the path of hunters? The not knowing was a form of torture, a grinding helplessness that frayed my nerves raw. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. The weather forecast called for a powerful early-season storm, a tempest of wind and rain. It was the perfect cover. No rangers would be out. My tracks would be washed away. It was a foolish, desperate plan, born of love and fear. And it was a decision that would nearly cost me my life. The storm hit with a fury I had never witnessed in all my 42 years in those mountains. It wasn't rain. It was a blizzard, a freak, malevolent swirl of wet, heavy snow that turned the world into a churning vortex of white. The wind wasn't a whisper. It was a physical roar that tore at my clothes and stole the breath from my lungs. Within an hour, every landmark was gone, buried under a thick, uniform blanket. The familiar trails of my memory vanished. The forest, my sanctuary, became an alien planet, hostile and unknowable. The sound was all-encompassing, the shriek of the wind, the crack of overburdened branches, and the frantic, useless hammering of my own heart. I was no longer a seasoned woodsman who knew the language of the forest. I was just a lost, frightened old man, blind and deaf in a white hell of my own making. The cold was a living thing. A predator stalking me through the trees. I pushed on, driven by a foolish, stubborn hope that I could find the great cedar by sheer instinct. I was fighting my way through a thicket, the snow up to my thighs, when my foot snagged on a root hidden beneath the white blanket. I pitched forward with a clumsy, flailing motion. There was no time to brace myself. My entire weight came down on my left leg at a sickening angle, and a sound, a wet, explosive pop, echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my own shock. The pain was immediate and absolute, a blinding, white-hot nova that flared up from my ankle and consumed my entire consciousness. I collapsed into the snow, a scream tearing from my throat that was immediately swallowed by the howling wind. I tried to push myself up, to put weight on the foot, but the ankle gave way instantly. A fresh wave of agony and nausea washed over me. I was miles from my truck. I was crippled, and the snow was falling faster than ever. The grim reality of my situation settled in with a chilling finality. This was how it ended, not in a warm bed, but here, alone, freezing to death on a mountain that had been my life's work. I tried to crawl, dragging my useless leg behind me, but the effort was pointless. I was losing heat too fast. A profound, invasive numbness began to creep in from my fingers and toes, a slow, cold tide rising within me. My thoughts grew sluggish, detached. I thought of Eleanor. The guilt I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, exhausted resignation. I was going to see her soon. My vision began to tunnel, the swirling white world shrinking to a blurry gray porthole. The will to fight simply evaporated. It was easier to just close my eyes, to let the cold take me. I lay my head down in the snow, a strange sense of peace washing over me. I was giving up. I was letting go. As the last of my consciousness began to fade, a shadow fell over me. It was immense, a moving mountain of darkness that blotted out the snow-filled sky. It was so close, so colossal, that my dying mind couldn't even process it. There was no fear left in me, only a strange, final curiosity. This was it, then, the end of the story. Through the haze of encroaching darkness, I saw it with a moment of impossible clarity. A hand, a huge, leathery, five-fingered hand, its knuckles scarred and ancient. It moved with a slow, deliberate gentleness that defied its sheer scale. It reached not for me, but for a massive pile of snow.